Red TV. After Crimea, when you moved to southeast Ukraine with your group through Donetsk, and when you moved to Slaviansk, have you been supported by the local government? You mean in Ukraine, in Donbass, right? We were not supported by local government at all. Initially, in Slaviansk, the mayor, Nelia Stepa, thought that we are Russian soldiers and started, we didn't, she didn't know what was going on, so nobody really knew what was going on, so she called on the population to support us. But when she realized we are not Russian soldiers, but volunteers, she started dealing with the nationalist side. But, she already did what she did, and the fact that she's on trial right now is a good example for all traitors. So she tried to deal with both sides, and as a result, right now she's in court. And that's that's exactly what she deserves for trying to be a double agent and deal with both sides. Did you communicate with the resistance in Kharkov and everywhere else? Yes, I was dealing with other resistance groups since working in Crimea, Odessa, Kharkov, Simferopol, Kherson, etc. So, and I have already talked in one of the interviews that I had the choice to go to Odessa instead of Slaviansk, because people from Odessa really were begging me to go to Odessa and help, but my choice of Donetsk, Slaviansk, etc. have already risen up. So, and in Lugansk they have already captured the state security HQ, and Odessa was still having protests, gathering at Kulikovo Pole, walking around with sticks, but didn't actually do anything substantial. And my thinking was that you should help the people who have already risen up, that gave a higher chance of success. And the second thing is that even though theoretically we could have reached Odessa due to the collapse of Ukrainian Navy and the nationalist border security, but there was the question of supply and support, because we counted on the popular uprising leading to reunion with Russia, and Russian troops walking in without a single shot fired, disarming the nationalist troops, or nationalist troops mostly switching sides like it happened in Crimea. But it would have been hard for Russian soldiers to move into Odessa because it's quite far away. But the main thing was that Donbass has already risen up. So in Kharkov there were the largest protests. So why did they fizzle? On TV you can see one Mr. Konstantin Dolgov. He's working for the for Vladislav Yurievich Surkov, an official in the President's administration, and you should ask all the questions about the failure of Kharkov resistance to Konstantin Dolgov, because he had the most assistance, he had some funding from us, and he actually got the least done. Of course, there was a role played by the local oligarchs, the local mayor. As we know, they did go to the Kremlin, they did go to Moscow and consulted, and maybe they were indecisive themselves. We don't know what actually happened, but the thing is, they didn't support the popular movement, and there were no real leaders that could organize it fast enough. Even though tens of thousands of people risen up, they had no leaders. How did the communists that you met behaved? How did the communist resistance? well, the communist activists that I've met, it's not like we marched like Caesar through France and, local communists coming out in crowds to greet us. I don't think we should sink to such satire. We had 50 men. Let's not exaggerate things. Let's not talk like the Tartarin from Tarascon, from the famous satirical book, when he exaggerated everything and made elephants out of flies in every little thing. So let's not exaggerate the fact that 50 men drove through Donetsk, and those events are merely tactical. They only mattered strategically because the other side was ruled by complete incompetence and demoralized. So let's not draw it as this heroic saga that historians would laugh at later. I wanted to be a historian. I really wanted that to be my main occupation. So to me, it somewhat matters that later historians don't laugh at me like they laugh at Chapayev and people making anecdotes about the division commander. So, but to answer your question specifically, there was a small communist organization in Slaviansk. Initially, they tried to act independently, but later their leader, I won't name him because there might be some harm come to him or his family, although of course they fled and are currently in Russia. So at some point he came to me and said that he's disappointed, he can't do anything on his own, so he's joining the militia and working under my command. They tried to work independently, but soon realized they can't achieve much. So later he worked in the militia, and because he was quite aged, he worked in the rear. I won't exactly give you the details of what exactly happened, because back then I didn't really deal with politics and society. I mostly dealt with military questions. But I suppose what happened is they didn't get enough help from the communists in Russia and Ukraine elsewhere, and maybe he was disappointed with what his comrades in Slaviansk did. But what I can say is that the local communists did help the militia, the local Slaviansk communists. They worked preparing food. They brought humanitarian aid. I didn't ask them to do scouting activities, but they did bring us some reports when they could. But they weren't a large political party by any means. And, I wouldn't have let them to form a separate entity within the militia. And that's something I have mentioned before. I was categorically against any political units and formations within the militia. Even if monarchists came to me and asked me, Igor Ivanovich, you're a monarchist, let's form a monarchist unit, I would have done the same thing to them as I did to everybody else. Only the same conditions as everybody else. You do what you're told, no separate detachments, separate banners, separate slogans. Because if you have any sort of national formation, I was sharply against Cossack detachments for this reason, and I have seen many times that this was the correct position. No ideological formations, even if they are the best, the most brave, the most organized, they have two sets of goals and values. The goals of the militia, the overall goals of the movement, and their own values and their own goals. So at some point, those two can conflict, and if those two are in conflict, they would usually take the side of their own values and their own ideology, the goals of their corporation and not of the larger movement. And the example from our action is the behavior of the Cossack commandant company in Kramatorsk. When there was a retreat order, they assembled a Cossack council and decided to continue defending Kramatorsk. But when everybody else followed the orders, pulled out of Kramatorsk and moved to Gorlovka, they understood that they went too far, so to speak. But since they understood that they would probably be punished for this, well, you know, their commanders, the common soldiers, didn't really understand what's going on. But the commanders understood that, you know, I could declare them deserters and, you know, they could face a firing squad. Well, I probably wouldn't shoot them, but they would be sent to the trenches or something in the penal battalion. So they lied to their soldiers and said they had an order from me to retreat to the Zvarino border checkpoint. So that commandant company, with the mortar platoon that they had, where the Cossack commanders again had the Cossack council, and because most of them were from Russia, including the well-known Babai Cossack, the very picturesque guy that we picked up in Crimea because we were really short on men at that point, and we just had to take whoever came. So they did their council and left to Russia, leaving their men alone. But, you know, as the saying says, the bad luck turned out to be good. At the moment, Zvarino border checkpoint was defended by 30 men, headed by the call sign 105, who died in Debaltsevo later in the winter. So there were 30 men there. They had SKS carbines that I sent them from Slaviansk on the complete opposite side of the resistance. Take whatever little arms I have and send it to the only checkpoint in the Lugansk People Republic. So that Cossack company, that after their commanders deserted, joined the 30 men, holding the last border checkpoint and held it. And if not for them, we would have been completely cut off from the border. But that's an example why I was categorically against forming national or political units within the resistance. Because, you know, one day monarchists or communists or something, they are together with us, they're following us, and the next day they make their own decisions. And that was the same thing with Cossacks from Kazitsyn's detachments. Those gangs, they would, as soon as, you know, crap hit the fan, they were saying, you know, we are Cossacks, we need to be preserved, we are the remnants of a nation, and they would retreat. They wouldn't fight. The common militiamen could die, but they need to survive. So when people online blame me that I stopped a communist resistance forming, because, you know, I read what people write online, because not because I'm a masochist, but because I want to see whether people are saying something true about my feelings or whether it's something false. So I'm checking myself constantly. So when I read it, I see that things that claimed about me shutting down a communist movement, that's false. You know, if there was a real popular communist movement, I, as a monarchist, would have come there and joined it. Not because I'm a communist or I like Trotsky or something like that, but because, you know, when you're resisting Nazis, you have to join the overall movement that's resisting them, regardless of what banners it's marching under. But there was no communist movement, so we tried to make common banners that everybody could join. Yes, I have introduced some monarchist awards, the St. George Cross from World War I, the Nikolai the Saint award, but at the same time I made a victory medal, much like the Soviet medals. So we tried to unite people with under the banners of everything that was good in Russia before the Communist Revolution and after the Communist Revolution. So nobody made people to follow Orthodox Christian ideals or any communist ideals or monarchist ideals. Even when some monarchists did come from St. Petersburg as a monarchist unit, they were sent to a regular infantry company as common privates. Did you have communication with units in Lugansk People's Republic and the Prizrek Brigade, and specifically the communist unit within the Prizrek Brigade? I first heard about the communist detachment within the Prizrek Brigade already after I have left Donbass. As for the Prizrek Brigade, you have to understand it was formed with a lot of assistance and partly because of my assistance. Mozgovoi, its leader, Alexander Borisovich, he came to Slaviansk and for a week joined us in guarding one of the checkpoints. After that, I talked to him and he went to Lysychansk to organize defense over there. And I did give him some weapons. After that, every time I managed to secure some arms, I would send some to Prizrek, and Alexander Borisovich, up until my exit, had received all his heavy machine guns, all the mortars, all the anti-tank rifles from us. Well, he did capture some things, he did repair some enemy damaged weapons, but most of the heavy weapons and a lot of the light infantry weapons that he had were received from Slaviansk. So he followed my orders. He had declared that he voluntarily will follow my orders. We communicated with his headquarters via an encrypted line, and overall he was subordinated to me, but because of the distance and the lack of organization, this subordination was more or less nominal. He did what he wanted, what he should have. I haven't heard about any communist detachment within his brigade before then. When I was talking with Alexei Borisovich, he did come to me after we left Slaviansk, because one of his platoon defense points was destroyed. Almost a platoon of soldiers died, and he was asking me what should he do, and I ordered him to leave Lysychansk, and he was against it sharply. He was saying that, how can we leave Lysychansk? People believe in us, people consider us their protectors, they trust that we will protect them. I came with him to a map and showed him that for now they are holding Lysychansk, but in 2-3 days they'll be cut off by heavy armor. And behind Lysychansk there was Pervomaisk, Alchevsk, Bryanka, and all those areas were defended by like 30 militiamen armed with light weapons, also sent from Slaviansk. In Lugansk there was Bolotov. He did have rifles, but he never sent them to the rest of the LPR. I don't know what he did with them. I don't know if he sold them, or I don't want to know. But Mozgovoi had understood that if his brigade is surrounded in Lysychansk, then there will be nobody to defend the center of the front line, just like the nationalists took Popasnoe, which had a garrison of 50 men that was kicked out in a few hours because they had no combat experience, no weapons. And the Cossacks there also retreated without fighting. So he did take my order, and he did it right on time, in the nick of time, and they managed to hold the center in Pervomaisk, Alchevsk, Bryanka, that area. So then there's the question, why did you retreat from Slaviansk other than the encirclement? Did you have any other reasons to protect Donetsk or something? There were no factors other than the impending encirclement. People are now talking online that I went to rescue Donetsk because I thought it will be basically handed over to the nationalists. Yes, when I came to Donetsk, I realized that it was completely unprepared and nobody was even going to really defend it. But I left Slavyansk purely because of tactical considerations. We didn't have anti-tank weapons. The anti-tank weapons that we had did not function. The weapons that the nationalists showed that they captured in my headquarters, those were tank weapons that failed to fire. The ATGMs, the RPGs that failed to fire. And we had a very strict system of following all the ammo, everything issued, so everything that didn't fire was brought back and stored at the headquarters. And we didn't leave that much of the headquarters. Everything that we could use, everything that fired, and everything that was live, we managed to take with us. But as I said, we did not have anti-tank weapons. Nikolaevka was taken by the nationalists because there was nothing to stop them. They had 28 handheld anti-tank launchers, not a single one fired. They were basically mowed down by armed carriers, and they couldn't do anything. Unfortunately, we had very few anti-tank rifles, and they were mostly in Semyonovka. And, you know, even so, they could take out the armored personnel carriers, but they were completely useless against tanks. We had almost no shells. For 2 tanks, we had 1.5 combat loads. For Nonas, we had 2 combat loads for the 2 Nona mortars that we had. For the 9 infantry mortars, we had 57 mines, so less than 8 per mortar. So would be stuck. We would be shelled from the Karachun mountain. According to my calculations, they had approximately 80 artillery systems and plenty of shells surrounding us. Up until our retreat for the preceding couple weeks, it was hit very hard, especially the residential areas of Khimki, Artyomovsk, and we would be sitting surrounded, we would be constantly shelled, and we wouldn't have any shells to answer them. The nationalists would not attack because at the preceding weeks I was actually expecting a full-on urban assault, because considering the nationalists' overwhelming superiority in armor, numbers, and heavy weapons, we could only inflict a defeat on them, at least moral, within a city, because we had much more motivated soldiers. But they weren't going to assault the city. At the same time as they were cutting the last of their supply lines at Nikolaevka, they started deploying minefields and barbed wire all around Slavyansk. So their plan was obviously to turn Slavyansk into a big concentration camp, more or less. Then they would pound it flat with artillery, and we would still have to break out without ammo and without food, but through minefields and with much, much higher losses. And there was nobody left to relieve us. In entire Slavyansk brigade, there were about 2,000 fighters, with Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Drushkovka, etc., and about 1,000 supply guys, you know, cooks, doctors, family members, etc. But the main unit, 1,200 soldiers, was in Slavyansk, in Semyonovka, etc. So that agglomeration. If Slavyansk was surrounded, the other large group was about 500 soldiers in Kramatorsk with Khmury, but he understood very well, and I understood very well, that he would not be able to break through to us. Bezler and Gorlovka at the time had about 350 active soldiers, and 2 tanks and 2 Grad MLRS. And that's nothing. You know, the heavy armored group that was cutting us off at Yampol alone had about 100 armored vehicles and at least 30 tanks. So, you know, maybe their tanks weren't the best functioning, but our armor wasn't running very well either. My largest concentration of armor was in Slavyansk. There was 11 armored vehicles, 2 tanks, 2 Nonas, 2 BMPs, 2 BMDs, and some armored carriers with anti-aircraft guns on them or something. So that was nothing, considering what the nationalists deployed. Apart from that heavy armored group, each of their checkpoints had 4 tanks. So all the armored forces that we had could probably take 1 checkpoint, and then we would run out of armor, and they would have 99% of their armor still left. Knowing that nobody could relieve us, we had no other choice but to save the men, save the vehicles, save the weapons. We had to retreat in an organized manner and organize defense elsewhere. But the same night that we retreated from Slavyansk, moved to Kramatorsk, that same night, 2 hours later, we had a message from Artyomovsk that a heavy armored group has entered Artyomovsk and taken it. So that was deep in our rear. So that was essentially a second encirclement that would cut off the entire Slavyansk, Kramatorsk area. So after taking Artyomovsk, all they had to do is cut an undefended road between Konstantinovka and Gorlovka, and we would be surrounded again.